Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scottish Parliament. My name is Michael Mara, MSP for North East Scotland. It's a pleasure to chair this event today. I'm the Deputy Convener of the Finance Committee here in the Scottish Parliament, been elected since 2021. So thank you for coming to this event, which is held in partnership with the University of St Andrews. And we've got a great panel here today who are going to help us in our discussion for this early afternoon session on oligarchs or philanthropists. So pleased to be joined by Adam Lang, Professor, who's in the middle here, Professor Tobias Jung, and Dr. Sarah Kerr, and also Jason Boxt, who I think is joining us online. Do we have Jason? We signal from the back. Maybe he's. We'll see. We'll see if that comes off. So, oh, is he there? Hello. There we go. That's a good picture, isn't it? What a handsome gentleman. So Adam Lang, sitting in the middle here on my left, is Director of Policy, Insight and Advocacy at Carnegie UK. Adam was previously the head of Nesta Scotland and head of Policy and Communications at Shelter Scotland, a former trustee of SCVO, and he currently sits on the advisory board for the Scottish Health Equity Research Unit at the University of Strathclyde. Professor Tobias Jung is the Director of the Centre for the Study of Philanthropy and Public Good at the University of St Andrews. His research explores philanthropy's diverse roles in society. He's president of the European Research Network on Philanthropy, a trustee of Foundation Scotland, and co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Philanthropy. Dr. Sarah Kerr is a sociologist of wealth at the London School of Economics International Inequalities Institute and author of Wealth, Poverty and Enduring Inequality. Let's talk wealtherty. That's a word we'll maybe come back to. Her current work looks at the narratives we use to talk about wealth inequality and how these help to galvanise public and political support for higher taxes on the rich. And Jason Boxt is a principal of RXN in Washington, DC. You joining us from Washington, Jason? What time is it there?
Quite early.
Quite early, okay, yeah. So particular thanks to Jason on that basis. And so he's worked in public affairs and opinion research for more than 25 years with expertise in communications and digital research, reputation and brand management, campaign and message development and political strategy. Can we have a round of applause for our panel, please? So there will be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, as you would imagine, and give views to the panel throughout the event. However, if we can start, I'd like to open by asking each of our panellists some questions. So let's start with, would the panel agree with former President Biden's warning that an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedom, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead? Do we have volunteers? Why don't I start with Jason, down the line, from Washington, DC himself?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure. I would disagree with that statement, and I'll give you a couple of data points as to why. I'd like to preface that by saying I am not an academic, nor am I an expert on philanthropy or wealth. What I am is an expert in. Oh, can everyone hear me?
Is that better? Can people at the back hear? Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting thumbs up. Thanks, Jason.
Okay. Well, that was just a lot of self-deprecation for those of you who missed it. I am an expert, though, in public opinion, and so I'd like to offer just a few data points and facts as to why I disagree with former President Biden. The first is that trust in institutions and government has collapsed. 60 years ago, 80% of Americans trusted government to do the right thing. Today, that number is 20%. And that institutional skepticism is really the backdrop for how Americans view wealth and philanthropy. Two, the American dream itself seems fragile. When you ask my parents' generation, or if you look at the earnings of my parents' generation, 90% of the children of my parents' generation, so 90% of my cohort, have out-earned their parents. My children's generation and slightly older, only 50%. So there is this skepticism that you can actually do better than your parents. That skepticism is largely borne by lower income, younger people of color, and that then creates this paradox which we have today. Americans simply distrust elites and the system. And I think that the presence of wealthy people who try to do good is not necessarily different today than it was 50 or 100 years ago. The problem is maybe a communications problem, that Americans' distrust of elites actually shapes the way that they view these philanthro-capitalists. There's no arguing that we have wealthy people today who do massive good, public health. You look at the Gates Foundation, you look at the Omidyar Foundation. We have oligarchs who do good, but I think skepticism about institutions actually shapes this generic distrust of wealth.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Sarah, maybe it'll come to you. And this is, I suppose, Joe Biden's equivalent of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. So his core critique, I think, on departing office of the nature of capitalism rather than just its outcomes. I mean, is it a concern that you share?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the polling data is probably consistent between the US and the UK in terms of people having deep mistrust, not just of politicians and government, but of systems. And it splits left-right a little bit in the UK. I'm not sure how it splits between Democrats and Republicans in the US, but people on the left and right mistrust institutions because they think they're incompetent and inefficient, and that's quite consistent across. On the right, there's a more deep-seated systemic mistrust that we might call conspiracy theory, but I think we'd be ill-advised to call it that. But it's a more systemic mistrust where people can tend to think that the whole universe is governed by BlackRock or a couple of rich people sitting in a room. But it does have a corrosive effect on people's participation in democratic processes. Having said that, we just published a report with Joseph Rowntree Foundation called Talking About Wealth Inequality, and we found that frames that we use that increase mistrust, so make people more mistrusting, don't necessarily make them disengaged. They still want higher taxes on the rich and they still support greater distribution. So I think the big conversation in social change organisations at the moment is how do we mobilise these frames around rigged system and unfair influence that are really deeply held mindsets across a lot of people without triggering far-right populist narratives that end in anti-immigration sentiment, etc. So I think it's, lots of similarities and probably a few differences between the two.
And Adam, on this issue of trust, I don't want to misquote Jason, but he was talking about people's perception of philanthropists that do good and the question of whether people have trust, as Sarah's touching on there. Is trust a core issue within this conversation as to whether people can play a positive role or a negative role in the use of the money that they're bestowing upon other people?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think trust is essential. And if I can maybe just look that back into the original question as well, because I think I can attempt to address both. Although I am sitting here feeling like the least qualified person to be on this panel among such. Yeah, okay, all right, fine. As long as we're all feeling that way. But to bring it back to the quote that kicked off from Joe Biden, I think that oligarchs, philanthropists are not new. It's not a new thing. They've always existed, probably, and in some ways you could critique a lot of democracies and say, well, oligarchs have always been present in them historically to a greater or lesser extent, and maybe actually we've come out of a period of abnormality where they've been slightly less present. But I think what is really particular about the state, and this is where it links to the point about trust, and perhaps as well the polling that was referenced in particular, is the particular nature and type of the oligarchy we're seeing in America at the moment, the kind of broligarchs, the tech bro sort of oligarchy. And I think that's really interesting for a number of reasons. One is the scale of the wealth inequality that they represent. We're probably going to be living through a decade of seeing the first trillionaires come around, driven by AI, driven by the technology that a lot of these companies and individuals represent. And so the scale of inequality contributes significantly to this issue of trust, I think. If people can't relate to the people that are wielding this influence and they can't feel connected to it, it doesn't encourage trust. The other thing, and this is something that we'll maybe come back to later, is the nature of the fact that quite a lot of these people are young to middle-aged men in particular. Now, the nature of the world, for lots of very wrong reasons, is that probably oligarchs have always predominantly been men, I suspect. I don't know that definitively, but you could hazard a guess. But I think the nature of the sort of tech bro oligarch is such that a lot of the idea of philanthropy, at least in my own personal understanding of it, comes from this idea of giving money to do good that will outlast you, good that will live on after you, whether it's libraries or, as was referenced, work in healthcare that will have a legacy long beyond your time on this earth. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to observe in the narrative around the kind of tech bro oligarchy is that's not their mindset. Their mindset is trying to cheat death, whether it's colonies on Mars or AI sort of as a tool to keep your consciousness going, or longevity. They're not thinking about a world after them. They're thinking about optimizing a world for them now. And I think that contributes to this idea of trust. People can't connect to that sense of trust or philanthropy in that context as a form of public good. It's more philanthropy as a form of self-serving the world they want to live in. And I think that raises really interesting questions in this space.
It definitely does. Tobias, is that a characterisation you agree with, both the eminence of Joe Biden and Adam Lang?
Absolutely. And I'm going to be academic and say depends. Yes and no. So, and first of all, as regards the oligarchy, and what do we actually mean by oligarchy? If it's like the rule of the few, we don't necessarily have that. It's like the attempt to influence. So we've got a nuancing there. Have you always had them? Yeah, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, they all had like similar patterns. It's like the influence they ruled, like especially Rockefeller in international health, is actually quite similar and took place at a time of less constrained political frameworks, actually. If you come to philanthropy, though, I think poor philanthropy. Yeah, and it's like supposed to be the love of humanity. It's supposed to be a gift. If you look at the nature of what philanthropy constitutes, it's hugely misconceived, rich giving to the poor, which is not necessarily the case. We've got poor to poor giving, poor to rich giving, rich to rich, etc., etc. I think it's like important to nuance and unpack what do we actually mean by philanthropy and how does it play out.
And do you think are we witnessing then a new model of philanthropy at the moment, but you think it just continues to be rooted in the history and the practice that has happened before?
So I think there's a lot of rebranding going on. A lot of these people come from the tech sector. Innovation is key. Yeah? If you actually go back to Andrew Carnegie, writing 1899, Gospel of Wealth, he highlights that we need more scientific philanthropy, more evidence. It's like in order to do good. And these ideas underpin, it's like the philanthrocapitalism that was referred to, it's like the increase of business models as well. So I think it's just a continuation of a trend that's been long going.
Okay. And then the other term in our question then about oligarchy is your studies around philanthropy, but is there a form of new oligarchy emerging that has been facilitated by the idea of philanthropy?
Tricky question. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say so, no, because again, it's like, if you look at how does that philanthropy take place, it normally takes place through the foundation form, which was the same at the beginning of the 20th century. The problem is as soon as we start talking about the foundation form, is actually that these don't technically exist, because there's no legal form of a foundation in the UK, there's no legal form of a foundation in the US. It's a tax distinction. So we're talking about these creatures and these structures that are being used that technically are non-existent, so it's quite problematic.
Yeah, it is problematic. I suppose one of the issues that we come from trust is that the suspicions of the what was the word used?
Tech bros.
Broligarchy.
Yeah.
Broligarchy.
I didn't make it up.
Okay, no, I've read it somewhere else. Let's go with that. The broligarchy is that it doesn't seem to be politically constrained, Sarah. We've come from more of these people lining up behind President Trump at his inauguration were previously Democrats. It's almost it's breaking free of some of the traditional roots of politics that might have constrained what would have defined an oligarchy and how they means. Have the size of the wealth and inequality mean that these individuals are breaking free from those constraints?
Yeah, I think so, but I think also we should kind of focus on the continuity. So I was chatting to ChatGPT last night, that's how tragic I am. But I asked it, what's the share of wealth held by the top 1% and the bottom 50% in every political administration since Reagan? So that's Reagan, George H. Bush, Clinton, George W. Obama, Trump, and Biden. So out of all those, when do you think the top 1% held the most wealth as a proportion? Anybody? Obama. And I think, you know, instinctively we think it's going to be somehow more equal under Democrats. It's really not. So, I mean, it's not, you know, it's not vastly different in each context. But the important thing there as well, the top 1% held 33.5% of the wealth on average over the 2 Obama administrations. The bottom 50% held 1.4% between them. So this is the kind of challenge, I think, is this is what's enervating people, is they are annoyed at the visibility and the kind of brazenness of having your front row, your inauguration, not taken up by democratically elected people, but by these people, you know, demonstrating this vast inequality.
Yeah, please, now I'll come to Jason.
Because Oxfam does an annual wealth report, and actually that nicely illustrated over the last decade, the 5 richest people in the world have increased their wealth by more than 34 trillion. And like the average they have is 690 billion, which is bigger than the GDP of Belgium, Sweden, Ireland, Austria, or Norway. So it's like, that's the scope we're talking about, and I think that's new, sorry.
Can I just add to that as well, stats-wise? We're throwing the stats at you today. But what that Oxfam report also shows is that poverty, the number of people living in poverty, hasn't changed since 1990. And this raises a big question for philanthropy. Philanthropy perceives itself as doing social good and lifting people up. It's really not. It's not doing that. Sorry.
I'm going to come to Jason now. Yeah. Come back to Adam.
I'll throw some more stats out. Why not? A recent survey of Americans showed that 44% of Americans believe that they will become a billionaire in their lifetime, which is patently absurd on every measurable metric. The interesting, Sarah just mentioned something about sort of the perception of wealth and seeing these wealthy non-electeds and reference to Obama. It shouldn't escape, you know, the conversation that President Obama maybe had people on the dais when he was inaugurated. President Trump actually invited the world's wealthiest man, gave him the keys to the White House, and we're still feeling the impact of that. I do think one of the differences here that we're seeing is that there is this very interesting paradox where there is a small but not insignificant percentage of people who don't look to the wealthy as some kind of a means of support or uplifting, but rather with a view of they want to be like them, that they see these wealthy people operating outside of a system that they believe is broken. And so I think that, you know, again, going back to sort of public perception, I'm old enough now where I can make jokes about being old. I was certainly not around when Carnegie and Rockefeller were doing their business. But I wonder if you had asked people then whether A, they were aware of who these people were, and B, how they viewed their role in society, whether it would be different than the way that Americans today view Bill Gates or George Soros or Michael Bloomberg. I do think, though, that politically speaking, there is a growing class of people in the electorate who don't want that hand up from the wealthy, but rather are looking for a different way of getting wealthy. That they see that path, that personal path for financial growth, and they increasingly see the government not as an aid in that, but rather as an obstacle. And I think that is shaping a lot of our politics today.
I mean, it's an illusory path, though, isn't it? As you reference in your initial statistic, you know, the way that Elon Musk particularly became a billionaire was being the son of other billionaires. Yeah. Okay. Adam.
Thank you. So I don't have any facts on this, but lots of opinions.
Lots of opinions.
Right? Okay. I think there is something really interesting in here about the role of philanthropy as well. I mean, I'm not saying there is a single role or a single definition or a single type of philanthropy, and I think one of the things that is perhaps really positive about the field of philanthropy is that it is varied and different and can do lots of different things. But there is something for me about in this context of the conversation between oligarchy and philanthropy, which you could argue are just two sides of the same coin and maybe are both just ways of explaining accumulation of wealth. But there's something about the role of the state and the role of The point I was going to make was about the intersection between philanthropy and the role of the state, and how what is the purpose of philanthropy in different contexts. And I think in this equation of oligarchy versus philanthropy, or that is the starting point, it does become interesting, because I think one of the things that we see today, which again has maybe always been true, and I would very much defer to Tobias's expertise on that, but you're seeing such accumulation of wealth and power. It's not just money, it's the particular type of technological wealth and the power that wields over things like our democracy and our democratic process, that I think you're starting to see some of these oligarchs or tech pros or whatever you might call it question the role of the state, or question the role of the nation state versus the incredibly influential and incredibly wealthy individual. And I think that is where you start to see some of these tensions play out. There's other things, of course, about the particular nature of political financing in America. That's a very different thing than it is here. But just when you can exert that much influence and that much power, and you start to be constrained by this idea of the nation state, which historically had the military monopoly, had the sort of the power, and if you can question that and come up against that, I think that puts us into a very strange place for the role of philanthropists and oligarchs in the 21st century.
Because part of the examples have been used by the Rockefellers, Carnegie. Part of this was wealth being giving make you proximate to power and access to power and influencing the shape of the state. But your contention with that, Adam, is that these algorithms and platforms are moving these individuals beyond the state.
Well, I think so, because I think since then we've had 100+ years of globalisation. The world is a more open and connected place than it ever has been. Yeah. The role of technology is more dominant than it ever has been. And these platforms, whether it's X or Meta or whatever it is, I'm not picking those two particularly, but they're obviously the big ones. It cuts across traditional understanding of mass communication, traditional understanding of direct engagement with citizens in a way that I think is, if not new, certainly more prominent than it has been before.
And that technological change beyond the realms of the state makes, I suppose, a bit more challenging. I'm slightly troubled by this issue of obviously the kind of individual agency. When we talk about how these technologies in a way are personified by individual white definitely not middle class, white middle-aged men. Because Andrew Carnegie said in The Gospel of Wealth, the rich had a duty and moral obligation to use their wealth to benefit wider society. I mean, I suppose we could question, does that kind of ethos, is that what underpins the same idea of philanthropy, or are we just way past that now? Are these individuals actually acting in a broader sense of responsibility, or has the model completely changed? Tobias?
I think we are sort of conflating various things here. I think so far we're talking about an oligarch problem, which is there. We're not talking about a philanthropy problem. It's like we're also critiquing philanthropy for failures that are essentially failures of the state. Taxation. It's like wealth accumulation. It's like philanthropy is and always has been about complementarity. You mentioned like the military role of the state. If you go back centuries, it's like the state provided military protection. It didn't provide healthcare. It didn't provide education. Philanthropy did. Philanthropy is like has that complementary potential throughout history that seems to be getting lost here. Coming back to the question around like the responsibility of wealth, I don't think that has changed, because we've got like the Giving Pledge. It's like we've got various initiatives. It's like if you look at the opportunities that philanthropy is taking out and carrying out where the state doesn't want to interfere, can't interfere, it's like they're massive. So I think it's like there's a huge conflation going on between oligarch and philanthropists. Like if you look also at the resources in philanthropy, they're tiny. And if we look at the Gates Foundation, Novo Nordisk, biggest one, Wellcome Trust and others, like 5 foundations that dominate the discourse. It's like 90% of foundations globally have less than 10 million pounds. 50% of foundations globally have less than 1 million pounds. These are not the big players. So if you like look at the big 5 and then like make a judgment across the entire philanthropy field, I think there's a misconception and miscasting.
Adam, was that you worked for the Carnegie Foundation? Was Andrew Carnegie's dictum of this, of the idea of the gospel of wealth, was it ever true? Or was it just true of him? Was it even true of him?
I didn't know the guy. And I definitely, I really, very, very clearly want to say, a lot has been written about Andrew Carnegie by people a lot smarter and more informed about him, or who have studied him in a way that I haven't. obviously I do work for one of the 15 or 16 foundations that he set up around the world. My take on it, and just to be clear, this is my personal take on it, is that I think there are things in his character that were formed by his experiences, as is true for all people, as you could say. He came from poverty in Dunfermline, and he emigrated to North America, where he made his wealth. And I think having that beginning, in a way, you were alluding to earlier, a lot of what we see today is billionaires, the children of billionaires. That was not the Andrew Carnegie story. And I think that has a bearing on somebody, because those experiences and those things that you grow up with in the formative years of your life shape you. I think we could all agree to an extent with that. Certainly, public policy would tell you, that early years is an important point in the shaping of people's lifetime experiences. And yes, he wrote famously, "The man who dies rich dies so disgraced," which is a big sort of famously attributed quote. But I come back to, in my interpretation of that, and to be clear, that is my interpretation, I come back to this idea about he was an older man who was at the end, towards the end of his life, when he started to really meaningfully give away his money and write these works. And I think one of the challenges we're seeing today about oligarchy, philanthropy, I appreciate, Tobias, the distinction, and it's not necessarily helpful for me to muddle them in the way that I am. But I think one of the differences or challenges we're seeing at the moment is this issue of acceptance of things that will endure beyond you. So Andrew Carnegie was very passionate about things like libraries and music as well, but other things too. And it was driven by this idea of things that will endure beyond you, and philanthropy and a role for the fabric of society, for the good of communities. His mission and our mission today is to improve the well-being of people across the UK and Ireland. But he didn't dictate exactly how that was to be interpreted. One of the very progressive things he did in the establishment of the organisation I work for was to acknowledge that how that is interpreted should be open to the trustees of the charity at any given point in time, which I think is quite a progressive and forward-thinking thing 100 plus years ago. And I think one of the interesting challenges we're seeing now in the context of this question for today is, will that remain true with these people who have wealth many magnitudes greater, probably by the time they're done, than Andrew Carnegie had? But will they have the same philosophical underpinnings about the role of society, about the role of things like public access libraries, about the role of things like collective well-being and improving the social cohesion? Are these things that they value and want to leave their money to, or will it go elsewhere into other things?
I'm going to come to Sarah.
Yeah, I suppose we were talking earlier, weren't we, Tobias, about philanthropy sometimes being a bit of a distraction from the wider practices of wealth. And I suppose as a wealth sociologist, I feel it's my kind of duty to broaden it out a bit. So I think that, philanthropy means goodness towards humans, doesn't it? Love of humans. And so I think if we're assessing the kind of philanthropic impact of certain very wealthy people, we need to look beyond the bit they make visible through performative philanthropy. So if you think of somebody like Bezos, whose net worth yesterday was £236.8 billion, he's pledged 5% of that, but spent 1% of that. So it's a tiny, tiny amount of the wealth that he has, he commits to spending philanthropically. But the harm he does with the rest of his wealth, the footprint of that, is incredible. So if you think about the fact that he doesn't pay living wage, and there was a Stop Bezos Act that Bernie Sanders tried to get traction for in 2018, because £152.8 billion is spent by the government in the US trying to pay food stamps and all those other things for underpaid workers from companies like Amazon, who are making an incredible amount of profit and immiserating vast swathes of people. So if on the one hand, your footprint of wealth is causing poverty and harm, and on the other hand, you're repurposing a tiny proportion to try and mitigate the effects, we could question whether you are a philanthropist or not, and I think we probably should question that. I think one of the other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the texture of wealth and philanthropists is that in the olden days, with the kind of, industrial capitalist philanthropists, there was a link between their wealth and work. So, you might dispute that anybody can earn the amounts that those people eventually had, but they were industrialists and they made jobs for people. Caveating that, bracketing out lots of historical things we need to consider. But most of billionaires made today have just inherited. So for the first time in 2023, more billionaires inherited their wealth than earned it in any conceivable way. So I think the moral texture of wealth ownership is also changing a bit.
There's a link between the two. I think Jeff Bezos and Andrew Carnegie's attitude to trade unions wasn't that dissimilar, if I'm honest, in terms of the way that they acted. did you want to come into us at this point?
And first of all, it's like
I'll come to Jason next.
Carnegie is like, if you look at the life history, it's like he always gave from a very early age on. So it's a story that runs throughout his life. And I've had the privilege of working with the Andrew Carnegie Birthplace Museum recently, looking at some of the letters of condolence that Mrs. Carnegie received after his death. And it's like the diversity of facets and areas that Carnegie and other philanthropists touched, and the state wouldn't touch at the time, questions about racial discrimination and others, it's like absolutely fascinating. Carnegie very clearly highlights that, and he recognized that there was a social responsibility. It's like he made the money on the back of society, and he acknowledges that and says it's a responsibility of the millionaire or billionaire to actually give that back. And if the millionaire can't do that during life, estate tax. He very clearly advocates for estate tax at the end of the death, because then the state needs to take over.
Okay. Jason, on this area, you've obviously do work around public perception. Is the public perception of these individuals in the US, have you worked around that area in terms of the oligarchy and how people feel about whether they should give away their wealth or not?
Hey, sorry, I missed the first part of that question, but I got the second part of it. I have a little bit. Americans tend to view nonprofits much more favorably than they do wealthy individuals. Something along the lines of a 2-to-1. 60% generally view nonprofits favorably. Roughly 30% view wealthy philanthropists unfavorably, favorably rather, but that changes obviously once you inject specific names. I will say that there is this question here. I wanted to touch on one of the points that was made earlier. The idea that Carnegie wrote that it is a millionaire or billionaire's responsibility to help to do things that benefit society, and I would question, as we look at the evolving role of the state and the role that the state played 100 years ago versus the role it plays today, I think there is decidedly a different view of what benefits society today than what existed 100 years ago. And really, you talk about people 100 years ago who built their wealth based on building things, this sort of physicality of legacy. We repeatedly hear about libraries and hospitals and trains, these very hard and fast things. The things that billionaires are building today are digital. They are philosophical and they're ideological. There's less of a physicality to that legacy. And so as we look about what benefits society, I think it's a reasonable question to ask: are these wealthy philanthropists or wealthy oligarchs today, is their view of what benefits society shaped by the efficacy and trust that people have in our current nation state? And do they see, and is it reasonable to justify the next generation of wealth, or this generation of wealth sees the current role of the nation state somewhat skeptically, and sees the benefit to society as a digital and innovative solution rather than just building buildings and infrastructure?
And what happens, Jason, to public trust when decisions about the kind of public realm that you're talking about, schools, healthcare, public policy like climate solutions, when those are increasingly shaped by private donors rather than elected governments? How would the public feel about that?
Well, the problem is that the public often doesn't know of the work that's being done. I think most people... Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it's maybe just me, but yeah. Okay.
I think most people are wildly unaware of the work that's being done by the Gates Foundation and by, forget about Jeff Bezos, but his wife is pretty great, or his ex-wife is pretty great. But a lot of the work that's being done to support those areas where the state has failed goes largely under the radar. I don't think that most people know about the good work that's being done. I suspect that in their time, Rockefeller and Carnegie and so on probably were better known entities than a Bill Gates or a Pierre Omidyar are today. And I think that is a conversation that we can have about the role of media, which is probably an entirely different panel.
Has anybody read the book The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis? So he wrote a book about the fifth risk. It was about the transition to the last Trump government, and he tells a story about the civil nuclear authority in the US waiting for the political appointee to turn up to tell them what to do with all the binders, and they wait for a week and nobody comes, and they wait for another week and nobody comes. And at the end of the third week, somebody turns up who ran a casino in Atlantic City and has no idea about what they're doing at all. And this person had donated something like $30,000 to and been dissed down. I mean, when these kind of strategic, really important decisions are being taken by political appointees, Sarah, is there an issue of public trust about, and we're talking about the relationship between, I mean, I maybe reveal my own view of that, but between the money and the decision making?
Yes, I think we could all answer that, couldn't we? Yeah, definitely. And I think there's some really interesting work by somebody called Ingrid Robbins on limitarianism. So Ingrid's written this book which asks whether in certain circumstances we should put a limit on the accumulation of wealth. So she talks about in context of urgent unmet need, so when people are starving, or in context where we need collective action, so around climate change, for example. And her concern is around the bleed of financial into political power, so when wealth starts kind of operating as political influence. So I think there's a massive concern there, and since 2001 in the UK, contributions to political parties have doubled. So it's not only that it's a bad thing, but people are very well aware that it's also an effective way of buying political influence, and I think the visibility of that is worrying. When you look at the donors, the other ChatGPT conversation I had last night was around who the top 10 donors had been for each of the US administrations, and it's salutary. There are reasons people do that, and it obviously doesn't deliver good dividends for normal people.
Okay, Adam?
Thanks. So just coming back on the point that was made about not much is known about some of the philanthropic work that goes on, particularly perhaps in the States, although I'm sure the same is true everywhere. I think there's an important point in this context of this discussion that the same is true of democratic nation states. Governments are not actually very good, whether it's local or national, at communicating what they're doing and why it matters for people. And I think the reason I mention that is it has a bearing on this dynamic between philanthropy and then the purpose of philanthropy in a modern nation state and the role of the state in that interaction. Because there are lots of really positive things that a more open and transparent relationship between governments and philanthropic organisations could lead itself to. The idea of philanthropy as a kind of risk capital for the state, to test the things that governments might be wary of doing on their own, or to take the experiments in certain areas or test beds to see if different approaches work, is all totally valid and is really interesting and quite exciting. But one of the challenges we have, and we know this from our work today at Carnegie UK, we do an annual survey of people across the UK to understand their, how they're living. But one of the things we ask about is their democratic well-being. Do people feel that they have voice and choice over the decisions that affect their life? And the results are really, really concerning. Every nation in the UK scores really poorly. Out of a possible 100, if 100 is the maximum, nobody scores better than 41. And that's really concerning, because without a well-functioning democracy where people have a strong sense of democratic well-being, we're not going to be able to grapple with the difficult policy choices we face now and in the future. And I think that does have a bearing on this issue about how the state has an effective, open relationship with philanthropy in a general sense, and with the people who hold vast personal wealth, because there are constructive ways of working together. But if it's, here's your binder to go and run the US nuclear agency, thanks for the 30 grand, that's not it. Do you know what I mean? That's or it shouldn't be it.
Come back to the original question about public trust when decisions about schools, healthcare, climate solutions are increasingly shaped by private donors rather than like the government. I think the way the question is phrased is hugely problematic, because it first of all highlights that governments are always good, philanthropy is always problematic. There seems to be an artificial conjunction there. If you look at the history of philanthropy and the state, it's never either or, it's always working together. If you go back to Bethlehem Hospital, which up to 1957 was like the oldest mental health hospital in the world. It's been governed by the state, the crown, philanthropy, and the private sector. Throughout its history, it's always coming together. If you look at the undemocratic nature of philanthropy, actually that can be advantageous, because philanthropy can take the risk capital. It can make decisions and approach areas that the state wouldn't dare to touch. Examples are civil rights, 1950s, 60s, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, Rockefeller, HIV/AIDS, Ellen John AIDS Foundation, Ford Foundation, LGBTQ rights, tobacco control, climate change, independent journalism, drug policy reform, prison reform, sex workers' rights, avant-garde culture. So there's a huge area where philanthropy steps in that the state simply doesn't touch. So I think there's we need to nuance that a little bit more than just saying it's other concerns. And going back a step further, we see a lot of Zuckerberg and others fiddling with public sector areas. But that's not necessarily philanthropy.
Is there not this question of accountability around the philanthropic, this blurred view, whether it be in partnership or whether it be as a substitution, is this idea of accountability that Adam raises about how can the public feel that the qualitative difference to any of that in terms of not just outcomes to me is about whether people have a voice in making the decision or not. And effectively they don't with philanthropy, I would contend, in the way they do with democracy. Is it not fair that accountability is actually a key issue and problem for the philanthropic means of delivering public outcomes?
It depends, as is for the state. St. Andrews opposite is Dundee. It's we believe some of the statistics, 1/3 of all the school children in Dundee go hungry over the summer because they don't get school meals. That is a state failure. Philanthropy steps in to support those areas. So where does the accountability sit there? So I think it's a mixed accountability.
It's a failure of capitalism by which philanthropy is the veneer upon which is a kind of keeping that system going. It's not necessarily the responsibility purely of the state to ensure that people are funded. It's the economy that we run that isn't putting enough money in the pockets of the people to feed their own children.
So that's why I think it's we need to go back to the question, what is actually philanthropy? It's what is the role of philanthropy in the state? It's how do we support it? How do we limit it? It's how do we make sure that it works together? And as part of that, it's things we've been working on at St. Andrews since December is trying to develop a national conversation on philanthropy. What do we mean? What are the promises? What are the problems? What are the pitfalls? And how can we make sure that philanthropy works with society?
Okay. And Sarah, on this issue then of the accountability, transparency and alignment with the democratic values that I think would be general acceptance of still, despite the times we live in, around the intervention of private money into public policy. How do you think we can ensure more accountability in that area? Do you think it's necessary?
Yeah, I'm someone who thinks no one individual should have an amount of wealth that means they could voluntarily uplift society. That's a ridiculous amount of wealth to have, entirely unaccountable. And because it's voluntary, you could choose to do it, you could choose not to do it. Putting that decision in an individual's hand is immoral and impractical, as dangerous. Bezos can't spend his wealth fast enough to uplift society across the board. So I think we just need to kind of understand wealth as a social problem and tax it until it's not dangerous. And then, if you've got a few spare millions to spend after that on your pet project, have at it. But really, it should come through government. We definitely need to improve trust in democracy, democratic institutions, etc. It's corrosively low. People aren't voting. They don't believe their vote counts. All those things are wrong, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't tax wealth. Government is able to spend that revenue, and philanthropic organisations should eventually put themselves out of business, as we were talking about earlier. There shouldn't be a need for them.
Jason. Follow the first round of applause, Jason.
That's a tough spot. I have a slightly different view on wealth, probably because I'm just a stereotypically greedy American. I don't have an inherent problem with wealth. I do agree that we need to do a better job as a society of taxing the wealth. There's this really interesting a conflict, I think, that the group that you would expect to have a greater skepticism of wealth are, and obviously in this case, it's Democrats, but Americans have, but Democrats are the ones who people trust the least when it comes to, or at least Democrats tend to create less wealth, and therefore the state becomes more like a nanny caretaker. And Americans today have a real distrust in that. 70% of Americans at least believe that that the wealthy have a moral responsibility to improve society. But I come back to the point I made earlier. I think there's a real lack of clarity or agreement on what is actually good for society. And, you know, again, come back to our elections, where we continue to elect really wealthy people who take pride in the fact that they don't trust the government to do the good work. So it's a tricky spot. But I don't have a problem with wealth as a concept. I think if the state were a better steward of funding and were better at doing what it could, you would have less distrust of the state in terms of taxing the rich.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, we're going to start being actively participatory now. So we've got some microphones going around, and if we're going to take some questions, if I can ask, please be as brief as you possibly can, and I'll start to get annoying otherwise, to allow as many people in as possible. You probably think I'm annoying already. Okay, this gentleman first of all, and then we'll come to the other side of the aisle here.
Cheers, thank you. Just a quick one, and just thinking firstly around this idea of philanthropy and going back to what Tobias was raising, just this idea that we have this pedestal setting that we have in terms of the big name billionaire bros, and what it actually means to be a philanthropist. If you're on a minimum wage and you put £5 away, how do we tell a better story on the contribution of everyday people, rather putting kind of that brand identity and kind of credit towards people that are, for example, with the example of the Jeff Bezos, kind of doing more society ills, but are kind of whitewashing it with kind of philanthropic needs, and often not having like names on tops of like art centres and all of this, when actually everyday funding should be highlighted more, what we can do more around that. And really quickly on the issue of societal issues, I mean, I work for a charity that works on abortion rights, right? And it's contentious, and we've been very heavily reliant on philanthropic funding, which is getting more conservative through time. And we're now in a situation where public funds are reduced, and we're being approached by governments to go to philanthropic organisations to fund essential abortion rights services where there's a shortfall in public funding. Those boards of the philanthropic organisations don't have that transparency and accountability. So I completely get what Adam's sharing around the challenges with government funding and transparency and trust in systems, but there's an accountability to ask your elected representatives, Freedom of Information and others, which just doesn't exist there with the Mackenzie Scotts and others, they're private boards. So just how we involve that more, how do we get more transparency there?
Tobias, the first part there on the nature of, I suppose, talks to your point about the broad range of philanthropy. It's not just the big ticket numbers. It's about societal giving as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So if we talk about philanthropy, it's often the misperception, rich give to the poor, and this is always about money. But if you look at the definition of philanthropy we use, it's about the use of private resources, time, treasure, talent, ties, for public purposes. So on that, nobody is too poor to give. Everybody can be a philanthropist. It's about harnessing that. It's about telling the story. It's about showcasing the diverse faces of philanthropy that we have in Scotland. One thing is very quickly, is there's a lot of conflation going on here across policy context. The US policy context around philanthropy is quite unique. It's we've got a social welfare system that's slightly stronger than the US. So the historic settings, the context, are massively different. So trying to transfer questions and ideas from the US in order to interrogate Scottish policies and politics and practices is quite difficult.
It's difficult, but it's not impossible. I mean, the gentleman, obviously in the second part of his question, raises the issue about this blurred line between politics and giving, and essential public good having to be paid for out of private means. I mean, Adam, is that a concern for that Carnegie have as a policy advocacy group about that relationship, and how do you govern that tension?
Yeah, it's a great question. A few years back at Carnegie UK, we did a piece of work which was an umbrella term called the enabling state, and it was about an effort to sort of reimagine what a different kind of state could look like, and in terms of answering your question, because a lot of the discussion we have on this front here in the UK is our governments kind of swing between centre-right and centre-left, at least at the moment. We'll see what happens in the future. And so you had a sort of a slightly more deregulated free market mindset a little bit over here, or a slightly more regulated interventionist mindset over here. But consistently, for over 100 years, the same type of people were falling through the gaps of provision, often the most vulnerable, the most marginalised, and those with the least. And so what was an alternative vision for the role of the state that was more reflective of, to touch on Tobias's point, the interaction between state, what you might call charity. I know that's another term that maybe confuses things even further, but this idea of a voluntary sector where people volunteered not just money but time or connections or experience that enabled more things to happen. And so I think there's still a lot of merit in that idea of taking some of this back to first principle questions about what's the role of the state in the 21st century. You know, we hear talked about a lot, this idea of the social contract, the post-war social contract is freeing. We certainly see that play out in our data around trust and connection. So what's a new social contract? What's a new vision for the relationship between citizen and state that reflects the world we're living in today and can rise to the challenges we have now and the long-term things? Because things like net zero or like technology and AI, these are generational shifts that we need to be doing long-term policy for, and that's really bloody difficult. Our political structures at the moment are inherently short-term. You know, they're 4 or 5 year cycles, funding for 4 or 5 years. How do we break out of that into this longer-term stuff? And I think that's where the question of this idea of regulation, of transparency, of openness, of accountability for the voluntary sector, for the private sector, for the public sector becomes really, really critical. And I think the whole thing needs reimagined.
A question on the end here, and then I'm going to come to... Oh, OK, so there was the next one was over there. Yeah, and I'll come to you next.
I'll try and keep the point brief. Firstly, do you think there are parallels with the Renaissance in any way, that actually these, particularly the oligarchs, have a power to give platform to different voices? And also thinking about siloing and fragmentation. How do you stop the oligarchs in particular, I'm thinking Musk and Zuckerberg, from dividing people up and ruling effectively? And also thinking, how do you stop the sort of the oligarch and philanthropists generally from getting isolated in themselves and not having a reality on the ground, whether at a national or international level?
Thank you. Sarah, the issue of the oligarchs wielding direct political power, to me feels like something we've kind of skirted around. But this is the question is really about how wealth directing political direction, isn't it? Is that how you perceive what's going on?
I'm not sure I really got the question.
I misinterpreted the question, but...
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Okay. In terms of whether they do that, or whether they should do that, or whether there should be limits. Do
you think they do it?
Yeah.
Okay. Jason?
Well, I mean, Elon Musk had a key to the White House. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we really need more evidence beyond that. I will, on the latter point that was made by the question, I do think there's something very interesting that we're seeing here in the US. I don't know that it's happening to the same extent in the UK, but there does seem to be a bit of a collapse of civic engagement. That the questioner asked about national or international solutions, and I think increasingly foundations are being asked to step in and create local solutions. That the world is getting so big, and the distance between what the nation state can do and how the individuals can feel its impact is growing wider and wider. And I think a lot of philanthropy probably needs to be refocused on more local, tangible solutions rather than looking for national or international ones.
I'm going to take this question here from the audience.
Yeah, hi. We call this the Festival of Politics, but I think a lot of us see it as a festival of democracy, which is a good thing. And I think what people are worried about correctly is the ability of wealth, be it in individual hands or corporate hands, to subvert democracy. And that's what we're seeing happening. The word billionaire to me should be an obscenity. No one should be a billionaire. You can't work that hard. You can't be that clever. And as the world becomes more and more between the rich and the poor, the power wielded by the rich is generally in their own interest. And we need to remember, like, the British royal family were involved in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and they were trying to avoid tax. The same applies to your oligarchy and to the large corporations that are trying to promote private health care by funding politicians. There's a huge issue over their promotion of Israel and Israeli interests, subverting British democracy. I think that is the nub, is how much is wealth and capital able to destroy our democracy.
Yeah, Adam.
So I think there's a really important point in there about the. So one of the things that I think is a shame when this current UK government came into power and had its missions, in which, you know, broadly all good stuff, but one of the things that was missing, I think, that we at Carnegie UK certainly talked about, was the idea of a mission to renew our democracy. Because I think that there is something really significant happening, and not just in one area, but across the board, whether it's participation, engagement, trust, a sense of connection, you know, you name it. How we renew our democracy for the years to come is a significant task. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it is a significant and feels increasingly essential task. Because I would bring it back to this question today. I believe that the nature of some of the you know, to go back to the premise of today's session, the points Joe Biden was making in his statement, the way I interpreted it, at least in part, was the nature of the type of companies and the things they do. So if it's X or Meta or you know, whatever, the platforms these wealthy individuals have control over, and their role in democracy is something that feels quite, I don't know if it's new, because you could maybe make same arguments about printing presses and whatnot back in the day, but it feels of a magnitude more than perhaps has been the case in the past. And I think how we renew our democracy for the future is something that should be a top priority for governments across the UK.
Yeah, please, stronger agreement from me on that. But yes, next, and I'm going to take one at the back and then forward.
Just I pick up on that as well, because like a lot of the ways we talk about philanthropy here, like, are old-fashioned stereotypes. I mean, a lot of the philanthropy world is looking at relational grant making, like working with communities, place-based funding, community-based funding. So we see these trends actually playing out on the ground in a lot of philanthropic developments.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, question at the back.
Hi. I wonder if the panel could comment on the relationship that this building and our Scottish governance has in relation to industry, and particularly the kind of the super wealthy, because it strikes me that they can bypass it, that the lack of economic drivers, and perhaps our the kind of constant importance of our small businesses to the Scotland's economy, because it just gives us a distance and perhaps a lack of understanding about wealth and wealth creation in its really kind of large kind of sizes. And it just sort of strikes me that the super wealthy can buy up our land or our sports teams, but actually not necessarily engage with our democracy. And I'm not making a party political point there. I just wonder if you have any reflections on how you'd like to see governance in Scotland develop to familiarise ourselves, I suppose, with the people that are making money from our citizens.
A really good question. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I think just as we're trying to complicate what we mean by philanthropy, and something that Jason said about not being anti-wealth, and I'm not anti-wealth, and I'm just kind of making a kind of theoretical point before I go into detail, but I think some of the work we've done in focus groups where we've talked to people about what they think wealth is and what they think good and bad wealth is, people increasingly want some, because when your public services are on their knees, the only way that you can sustain a life worth living is by growing your own personal wealth. So degraded public services make people focus on individual wealth creation in a frustrating way. But the other thing that came out in the focus groups was a distinction that some sociologists have made between ordinary wealth and extreme wealth. And ordinary wealth being the amount that we might want to fix a boiler if it's broken, or to be able to put a deposit down on a house. So the kind of wealth that buys you economic security in a way that we should think of as normal. It's been normal in our lifetimes. It's increasingly not normal anymore. But these really quite modest amounts of wealth that people are talking about. And I think it's the same when we think about the influence of businesses. There are lots of wealth-creating smaller businesses who don't have as loud a voice, but who are as instrumental to keeping social fabric together and to growing community wealth and growing well-being, who don't get a voice at the table. So I suppose it's just agreeing that business and wealth should, if it's going to have a voice, then all kinds of business and wealth should have a voice at the table, however big.
Really good point. I'm going to take this question at the front.
I hardly dare challenge a title chosen by Anne Donald and Roy Devon, who I admire hugely. But is oligarchs or philanthropists the right question? Is the question actually, how do we optimise and best deliver philanthropy for best outcomes?
We haven't touched, for example, much on the tax levers.
Yeah. This is probably our man on this.
No, I absolutely agree. It's like spot on. It's like the.
I suppose that where I would perhaps disagree slightly, if I may, is that I think that what the question sets up is the tension identified by the past two previous questioners, that people are increasingly worried about that engagement. I think that Jason has pointed towards a bit of that. I mean, we could all want better philanthropy, I think, but this core tension between the influence and power and whether that philanthropy is actually a means by which to access that. Would you think that philanthropy is a means by which to access power? I'm going to ask, I'll take the answer to the question from the audience member.
I think there may be oligarchs who without a doubt abuse their power.
It's the philanthropists who abuse their power.
It's a black and white question, and actually, questions in life are not always black and white.
Very true.
So what we need to
Do is optimise the philanthropy for the best possible outcomes.
Because there's a question: are these oligarchs actually philanthropists? Because that's like the implicit assumption here, and like if you look at the given by Zuckerberg and others, it's minuscule. Yeah, it's like also the way it's being managed. It goes into limited liability companies. It goes into donor advised funds, which are like emerging philanthropic vehicle. And there's a lot of conceptual cloaking going on, where you like use a label of philanthropy for something that isn't actually philanthropy at all. It's pure self-interest. So I think we have to have that nuancing right.
Please.
Thank you. I've done a lot of canvassing recently over the last few years. Local elections, Westminster, leading up to the Holyrood ones. And the most depressing thing, I think, I hear is people saying, all those politicians are in it for themselves, and what's the point of voting? So I wonder if the panel could address that question.
Should I give myself a pass on that? I think that's probably, but yeah, Adam.
So I'm not a politician, right, at all. I don't ever really want to be, but I have enormous respect for all politicians, whether I agree with their political persuasion or not, because it is a hell of a job, and it is an essential job if you believe in democracy that we have. And I do believe in the democracy that we have, and I do believe in the power of public policy to make a difference to people's lives, a really positive and progressive difference to people's lives. I have 3 children, and if my children were ever to be born at any point in history, I'm so glad they were born now and here, because we hospitals, police, buildings like this. You know, I believe it is a good thing, and it has a powerful force for good. If to the question, the issue of trust, I think that rebuilding trust in democracy is essential. Bringing back some of the other questions from earlier, democracy has been rocked, I think, by a lot of scandals in the last 2 decades, a lot of recent technological changes that are changing the way democracy interacts, you know, the way our elected officials connect with and interact with and understand citizens across the countries or areas they represent. But all of these things are fixable. Democracy just kind of needs to catch up with a lot of those things, recognise that there is a problem, that just carrying on is the same, like a slightly better management isn't going to be enough to fix it. It needs a sort of root and branch rebuilding, I think. But I do believe in it. I do think it's essential, and I do think that I have enormous respect for all politicians, whether they're here, Westminster, the Senate, wherever, because they do incredibly difficult jobs that are incredibly important if you believe in democracy, which I do.
I wonder if you might answer it.
I knew somebody would do that.
Your perspective as a politician on that one. I think I just agree with what Adam said. So.
Yeah, I agree with a version of the same. I suppose I am, I knock on an awful lot of doors as well, and speak to people, and I do get similar questions. It's a little bit more, when you are a politician, it's a little bit more difficult when somebody says that to you. You know, you're just in this for yourself, and I know that if, you know, on that basis, that I took a pay cut to come here. It's a huge privilege to be here, and this is something that I treasure and see as a real privilege, having a role in people's lives and hearing their problems and trying to represent them as best I can. But I think of the sacrifices that I make in my own family life, the time that I don't spend with my children, which can be extreme at times. So on that personal level, it can be quite difficult. But I understand the frustration of people, and why I see that is people who don't see an economy that works for them, a country that they feel is going in the right direction. I think they feel, in this country in particular, I think a feeling of decline across the whole of the UK. That there's a country that is going in the wrong direction, that we are a generation coming, I think was referenced already, that is going to be poorer than their parents for the first time in history. In the last UK Parliament period, you know, incomes fell for the first time since the Napoleonic War, and people feel that acutely, and they see, not just in their own pockets, but in the communities that they live in. So I understand that feeling and that hunger for something different and for change. And also the frustration, which I think comes to the core of this question, if I'm honest, around the suspicion that that system is gamed against people and the ordinary citizen, that the power structures are in other people's hands rather than the democracy that the gentleman in the audience talked about, that our view of what democracy should be, that we could change if we wanted to change, but people feel that they can't, and how difficult that is. So yeah, that's how I suppose I feel about those issues. But I do have that common respect that you talk about, Adam, for an awful lot of people. But I also see, I think, a qualitative difference between some of the people, Elon Musk, others, who are participating directly in politics through the benefit of their own wealth, and not on the basis of anything that is accountable to anybody. And that worries me greatly, because I think it's really about further wealth accumulation rather than service. So that's my view. So we have Jason, but not a visual on the screen. So you have to look at me and listen to Jason. Is that the story? So anyway, we'll take another question and then we'll... Come on.
My job is to advise private philanthropists and institutional philanthropists. I think it's really interesting, the point about the division here between philanthropy and oligarchy. There is a trend in the US and the UK at the moment towards anonymized giving. And I wanted to make the point and to see what the panel thinks about that trend, because if I think about the people I act for, many of whom are not stratospherically wealthy and are motivated by a moral imperative to give, what they don't particularly like is to be lumped in with people who, for many reasons, are unpopular but are categorized with them. Is there any way we might try and make the atmosphere warmer for them, so that they feel a little bit more comfortable about giving and perhaps don't move towards anonymous giving, which itself is a little less accountable?
It's a very interesting question in terms of the shape of accountability. Tobias, is that something that you're seeing in the shape of philanthropy more globally and locally in your studies?
Yeah, and it's a huge tension, isn't it? I don't have the answers for that one. It's like, I have to go back to the ivory tower for that. But it's like, it's problematic. It's like, on the one hand, we've got the advantages of anonymous giving, because like quite often people don't want to be associated, except indeed, like depending on which culture you go to, it's quite rude being associated with the gift you're making. But then it's like, if you're blown in with like also of other givers, tricky. I don't have the answer, sorry, but I acknowledge the problem. But it comes back to the earlier question around, do we need a national conversation around philanthropy? It's like, what does it mean? Who does it? It's like, how is it carried out? What are the benefits for the tensions, and how can we address them? So,
I think it's interesting, coming back to the question that I think our first questioner asked about the relationship between policy and whether you'd be seen to be support a particular issue that is politically contentious, but you may feel that it's of greater public benefit around, for instance, abortion research, or that you can understand why people would want to be, in some regards, anonymising that. But at the same time, I think we have to, if we're going to have this accountability mechanism that has to be with it, at the same time, I also understand why you wouldn't want to be associated in the same way with the Sackler name, or for instance, given the controversies that come around that in terms of the OxyContin. I think it's a really complex set of issues. I'm going to take another one from the front, please. But I don't think you've got any real advice there as to how we might do anything about it. Yeah, but we all recognise it sounds bloody difficult.
Aye, we've heard a lot of discussion has revolved around the relationship between the philanthropy and the state in one way or another in different administrations in the States and here. I wonder if, in light of what Tobias was just saying there about the role of philanthropy in society and the work that you've been doing at St Andrews, we're in the Scottish Parliament. Do the panel have any suggestions, ideas to say how does philanthropy work with state better in Scotland, as opposed to the sort of Bezos and other people who, and I know he works in Scotland, but in a Scottish context?
That's for you.
It's for me. It's for resident Scots only. Is that the story? I'll maybe come to Adam then. I could give a view on that as well. But I mean, Sarah, by all means, if you feel no, okay, Adam.
No, definitely not an expert. So my take on that is I think a lot of it comes back, and I don't mean this as a cop-out, I mean it as a very genuine doing word here, to openness in this dialogue. I think the state in Scotland, but perhaps the UK and maybe many other places as well, has often not been as good as it could or should have been about leveraging in multiple types of other investment, whether it's private sector investment, philanthropic investment, or whatever. And it gets political very quickly. It gets like, oh, we want to do that. We'll be accused of X, Y, and Z if we do that. But I think a lot of that can be solved by being open about it and also acknowledging, as others have commented on and know better than I. But part of this is about reframing how our politics interacts with philanthropy. And what I mean by that is we need to be a lot more humble in the face of some of the policy problems that we face, because we don't know the answers to them. We don't know how to achieve some of the outcomes that we say we want to achieve in 5, 10, 15, 20-year time horizons. And the way, in my opinion, the reason I say that is that gives us an opportunity to leverage in, for example, philanthropy, but also private sector investment or other things, into working in partnership with the state. Different mechanisms, different approaches, but to say we don't know how to go, we don't know exactly how to do this, but here's what we're going to try, here's why, and here's how. And being more open about that kind of stuff, I think, is where we need to get to in a lot of our policy making. I recognise there's enormous political challenges around that because it's difficult to communicate, it's difficult to get public buy-in, but a lot of our work that we've done at Carnegie UK has shown that when you actually engage people in complexity and difficult things and bring them with you, they're way more tolerant of risk and way more out there than they often get credit for in either the media or political discourse. And so if we can find a way to do that, I think that's my take on how we can leverage in more and better philanthropy to work alongside, the state as well as private capital as well.
I know that it's an issue that the givers and bigger givers, donors, the people I've spoken to who have funded work in Scotland are wrestling with and have wrestled with for years as well. I think it might touch a little bit on Tobias's conception of almost additionality, that it's the state and I know I've spoken to and been involved with projects where foundations essentially have said, if we prove that this works, then the state can take that on. Well, what happens when the state doesn't have enough money to do all the things it knows works already? And actually that money is decreasing, going down the way rather than up. So I think this idea of almost the additionality, when you're using that money to pay for what the public might expect to be a core set of services, that becomes really difficult. And I think the interaction, for instance, with the third sector around some of that, where I see in my home city of Dundee, and you referenced some of the problems in my home city already, Tobias, in terms of the amount of poverty, where much of the public realm has been outsourced to the third sector, which makes it incredible. Oh, he's back, thank you. Which makes it much easier, frankly, for those services to be cut further down the line, to be delivered at a lower level of cost. But actually, it's the core services that we might imagine are part of the public realm that are actually being delivered by charitable giving. And I don't think the public generally understands how fragile that situation is. And it's one of the reasons that things have been extracted from public services on that basis. I'm going to, bring in one back. Oh, Jason's coming in. Good, okay. Hi, Jason.
Hi, sorry. This isn't specific to Scotland per se, but I've spent enough time in Scotland that I think it's probably true. I think it's incredibly complicated and challenging for philanthropies who tend to think in much longer terms than the political realities of engaging with the state, which will change every some number of years. It is the challenge of not only preferred outcomes and how those are often defined politically, but also the pathways to those preferred outcomes. I spent a lot of time working with the Gates Foundation here in the US, and it is a constant challenge of keeping the donor organizations kind of in line with current political sensibilities. And as those sensibilities change, how does the philanthropic organization or the philanthropist successfully get their much longer view of a preferred outcome through the obstacle course of quickly shifting political preferred outcomes?
I'm going to take one here before I come to Tobias, please.
Ask you a question?
Nope. Just behind.
So just to give some light to, or an example of what you were just talking about there, on Sunday 200 social care charities in Scotland wrote an open letter to the First Minister to say that due to the way that they are funded, their future feels apocalyptic. Many of those voluntary organisations will also be in receipt of philanthropic funding and trading income and in terms of the way that voluntary sector funding is delivered. So on the ground, the state and philanthropists are already all supporting different voluntary organisations, but because they don't talk to each other, that makes it really, really difficult for those voluntary organisations to put together that patchwork of different pieces of funding. So there is something at a really simple level, or on paper at a really simple level, about how government and philanthropists talk to each other about what they want to fund, what they want to achieve, what direction they're pushing in, which could make things much more financially stable and much simpler for the voluntary organisations that we absolutely rely on in Scotland. So those social care organisations who are about to go boom, what is the answer in the context of the limits that we know are there in terms of public funding?
Tobias?
Yes, sure. Well, you're from Dundee, you said. So, it's like the Rank Foundation and the activities being doing. So first of all, there's a huge convening power of philanthropy, bringing people around the table and the facilitative aspect. So, adding other capitalists. But coming back to the question there, last September, the Scottish Parliament had the pre-budget scrutiny of the third sector funding principles. The questions that were raised are ancient. How do we support organizations that are in trouble? It's like long-term unrestricted funding. What is completely missing is the underpinning vision as to what are actually the roles and expectations of the third sector, of the public sector, and of the private sector. And unless we actually interrogate them alongside questions about democracy, it's going to be continued to disjoint.
Yeah, really good. Adam.
So I completely agree with that, and I completely agree with the point that was made. The thing I think that is particularly frustrating about some of this in the context of Scotland specifically is that in many ways we're very well equipped to address some of these challenges. We're a relatively small country. It is possible here in a way that it isn't in, for example, even England or other mainland European countries, to bring most of the people together around one or two tables. That's not a difficult ask in Scotland. It's possible to convene the people you need. But a lot of what I think we often hit up against is some of the challenges around how government or the state conceptualises its role, a lot of the conversation comes back to a very transactional interaction, like, we need this to do this, or please give us this so we can do this. And what we often lack is some of the longer term thinking, to bring into some of the other points around saying, actually, this government, whatever government, is working towards these aims. How do we take a slightly multi-year view on our spending to get there, of our action to get there, of our convening power to get there, that provides the opportunities to bring in philanthropy or other forms of money alongside it where applicable. And that is something we just haven't had in Scotland, despite on paper having things like a national performance framework that is intended to cut across policy silos and, in a way that sets national level priorities. And I do think that if we can get back to some of the sort of stuff around shared outcomes, around the national performance framework and around longer term thinking on finance, we can actually make a meaningful headway in some of this stuff. But too often we don't. We keep coming back to give us X to do Y tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Adam. The lady here in the fourth row.
Thank you. It's been great hearing all your opinions, and I just wanted to ask, I'm going to deviate the conversation a bit, but celebrities are often criticized for superficial philanthropy, while tech oligarchs risk being seen as undemocratically shaping the public good. Since tech oligarchs command far greater wealth, does their structural power now eclipse celebrity soft power, or do these forms of influence operate in different spheres that remain equally significant for democracy?
Interesting. Tobias, is that something to kind of the interaction, celebrity and oligarch? I mean, I recall that, not going by Andrew Carnegie too much, but he was once referred to as like the most famous man in the world. And we talked earlier on about nobody knew who he was, but I remember that being at some point, that kind of level of power was.
It really depends on the casting of philanthropy again. So, celebrity fundraising and celebrity philanthropy is hugely problematic, as we know, because the key question is who actually benefits at the end of the day. Is it celebrity brand or is it starving children? Yeah, so it's I don't have the answer to that one either. Sorry. But it goes back to the question, what is actually philanthropy and what are the motivations? So it's although philanthropy is positively portrayed, we also have to acknowledge that a lot of philanthropy is rooted in self-interest. If you go back to the foundation form, it's if you go back to its early expressions in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it's about how do you make sure that your will is carried out beyond your death and in your afterlife, that you're being looked after. So I think there are a lot of tensions within philanthropy that are not necessarily acknowledged or unpacked. So it's but how can we then harness that self-interest in order to do it at the same time?
Yes, but I'm interested in linking it back to the question of trust, really, in a way, because I think when we did the focus groups, with left and right-leaning focus groups in London and York, and we asked people where they got their information from, news information, and most people don't get it from the news as I'm just scanning over here, I'm just going to say, demographics like mine, my age, kind of 50s plus. They don't get information from news, they get it from influencers. And that distorts the kind of knowledge landscape, because some of that may well be true or proximate to truth, and some of it's just nonsense. So I think there is an issue when wealthy influencers on online platforms who have a position of responsibility, frankly, have got a lot of wealth, and that wealth is seen as a proxy for other forms of capital, like information capital and knowledge. And people put their trust in it in a way that is perhaps disproportionate to the value of that information, and it can spread unhelpful messages. I think the context in the US, where there's much more respect for wealth, I think, in the US than the UK, especially amongst young people. But I think there is still a question of wealth distorting the messaging that is going out on online platforms, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm afraid that brings our questioning into the end. I'm going to give our panellists just a quick opportunity to give one final thought. They probably won't squeeze more than that into 1 minute each. And because Tobias is sitting next to me, he got the opportunity to go first.
Well, thank you. I've been volunteered. Yes. So I think the key question goes back to what is the meaning of philanthropy and what are its roles? And as part of that, I think we need to address 7 overarching questions within the Scottish context and beyond. First of all, who can actually do philanthropy? It's whom do we allow, whom do we enable, whom do we support in order to be philanthropists? What are the resources that can be used for philanthropy? So far, we've mainly talked about money. We've touched upon treasure, expertise, networks, and others as well. But quite often, there's a huge amount of non-material wealth expertise, knowledge in community as well that can be harnessed. Like, what is the purpose of philanthropy? Why bother? Why have we got it? What is it supposed to achieve? What can it achieve? How should it be done? So coming back to questions of trust, accountability, inclusivity, who benefits at the end of the day, coming back to the question of like, okay, who actually gains what out of the philanthropic interaction? Where does philanthropy take place and when does it take place? And bringing all of that together then helps us to inform the conversations around democracy, around the roles of the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, and the state.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Adam.
That was way more concise than I'm going to be able to do, so I'll keep mine very short. For me, I think a lot of this comes back to a really concerted effort to renew our democracy, because I think a lot of these tensions about the role of philanthropy or oligarchs or philanthropists, for me, are rooted in this idea of how do we renew our democracy? Our democracy feels in a difficult and slightly concerning place at the moment. But if we can grapple with big things like reimagining the role of the state, reimagining the relationship between the citizen and the state, the social contract, and then we can understand where the role of philanthropy fits in the role of the state today, and indeed the role of regulating things like some of the technologies that have been discussed today and how they're affecting our democracy and how they have a bearing on philanthropy as well. So for me, I think a lot of this comes back to a really deliberate effort, which is a big and ambitious thing, but to renew our democracy for now and into the future.
Jason.
So for me, this ultimately boils down to this issue of trust. I think people don't have problems with philanthropy when the manifestation of that philanthropy is something they support, and they have problems with philanthropy when it seems to be unfairly influencing outcomes in a way that people don't agree with. If the state is trusted more and if politicians are given the benefit of the doubt, then I think we're all in a much better place to have long-term conversations about what our shared preferred outcomes are. But our political situation, at least here in the US, doesn't really allow for that kind of a conversation. And that makes the job of the wealthy philanthropist all the more complicated.
So final word goes to Sarah, partly because she has my dream job, non-political job as Professor of Inequality at my old university, the LSE. So, Sarah.
Doctor, but thank you for the promotion. I welcome that. So my thing is going to be 2 words, and I'll get to it with a bit more of a ramble. But when Rachel Reeves came in, her pre-budget statement said, "We don't need to tax wealth to deliver our economic plan." And that reduces wealth to a revenue-raising question. So obviously, as a sociologist of wealth, I'm bringing it back to the broader question of wealth. Wealth inequality isn't just about raising more revenue for the delivery of public services, although that's obviously necessary. It's also a social justice question, a racial justice question, and a class justice question. The current wealth inequality isn't a neutral level that everybody experiences in the same way. At the end of your life course, if you're a woman in this room, you'll have 44% less private pension wealth than men. If you're a person in a Bangladeshi family, you'll have 10% of the wealth of a white British family. So the racial wealth divide, the class wealth divide, the gender wealth divide need to be addressed as part of the wider issue of how we problematise wealth more broadly. So my suggestion is tax wealth, basically.
Yeah, I knew she would be popular for that closing. Thank you all to our panel, all 4 of you, for fantastic contributions and for guiding us through today. Jason, thank you for giving up your very early morning to be with us as well. Thank you to all of you for coming to the Scottish Parliament today. I hope there are other events that you'll be able to attend this afternoon. There is a survey, I believe, that you can access via a QR code. We would greatly appreciate if you could fill that in. But on behalf of the Parliament, thank you for coming, and thank you, of course, to our panel.